Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Jesu, der du meine Seele, which translates to, Jesus, it is by you that my soul. This is a pretty dense chorale. It's actually part of a larger movement that has instrumental interludes, and if you have watched any of my videos in the past, you know that I have taken out the instrumental interludes because I'm focusing on Bach's vocal writing in this project, so I have assembled a chorale out of all of the passages that had a vocal part. So this is just a linear chorale with no interludes. But that being said, it does tell a continuous story and doesn't have really any awkward breaks, but there are some really interesting chord progressions in this chorale due to the fact that there's a lot of interplay between melodic minor and just what that does to the counterpoint. But let's hop right into the analysis. So we have two flats in the key signature. We start on B flat major and we end on G major, and I think there might be an argument to be made that we start in the key of B flat. It's not unprecedented for us to start in one key and end in another key, but I think we can analyze all of this in the key of G minor, and we have this very interesting descending line that turns chromatic a little bit before the halfway point into the phrase. But like I mentioned, we start off on a B flat major triad, B flat, F, and D, and that is our mediant in the key of B flat major. We then have a passing tone in the tenor. This B flat's a chord tone, and this A is a little neighboring seventh before we get A, D, B flat, and D. This is an interesting chord because if we called this A an accented non-chord tone and we looked at this G right here, we would have our tonic triad G minor. However, we get a C happening at the same time, which undermines that analysis because G, C, B flat, and D, that's like a chordal harmony, or it's like a chordal harmony where we can't really analyze it using tertian means. It's just like a byproduct of the counterpoint. So I think although one might be an analysis that you could argue that this C is just happening as a passing tone at the same time, I'm just going to say that the figure bass changes, and this is just a B flat major triad, B flat major 7 chord in third inversion, where this A is the seventh of the chord. It's an interesting chord progression. I don't think we've come across this one in the past. It doesn't ring a bell, but that's how I'm going to choose to analyze it, even though we can piece together a tonic triad. I just don't feel like the tonic triad is fully justifiable, but I will offer that analysis just in case. We then have F sharp, D, D, and A, that chord we have seen before. That's a D major triad in first inversion, which is our dominant. Then we get a bit of a deceptive progression. We go to F, D, G, and B natural, which is G7 in third inversion. And taking into consideration the fact that a C major chord happens afterwards, I reckon this is a secondary dominant in third inversion. That's 5-4-2 of 4, because we would expect C to follow, and G is the dominant of C, and that's what we get afterwards. But melodic minor, or this major sixth rather than a minor sixth, we get E, C, G, and C, which is uppercase 4 in first inversion. So it resolves where we would expect. Maybe not exactly where we would expect, but it resolves to a logical chord. We're then taken to E flat, G, G, and B flat, which is E flat major in root position. That is a 6 chord, passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor. We then get C, E flat, A, and A, which is A diminished in first inversion, 2-6. It's a likely cadential chord. We then get D, 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 and A with a passing seventh in the tenor. We know a 5 chord's being implied here, but there is no third in this 5 chord, which is really interesting. I'd say that this is a perfect authentic cadence because it is 5 going to 1, but we don't have that F sharp, which we would expect in a 5 chord. This is just an open fifth where the root is tripled and we get a fifth in the melody. So this is not unprecedented. We have seen thirdless triads even in cadential situations in the past, but this becomes almost like a motive across the entirety of the chorale. We do see a lot of third list triads, especially in cadential situations, and I think that's one layer taking the chorale, or the cadence rather, down a peg and having, even though the fact that it's a perfect authentic cadence, having it be a little less final because the leading tone isn't present. But it resolves to G minor regardless, G, B flat, D, and G. Okay, looking ahead, we have a phrase that ends in a half cadence in the key of G minor. No modulations actually the way that I hear the chorale for the entirety of the first system, so we're in G minor the entire time. We have another G minor triad here, G, G, D, and B flat with a passing seventh in the bass. Then we have E flat, G, G, and B flat, which is another E flat major triad. That's a 6 chord, passing seventh in the bass before we get C, A, G, and A, which we can analyze as a... It's kind of interesting because we're missing the tone that would contextualize this diminished chord. Because we're expecting a diminished chord, we can call it a 2-6-5 chord like this, the same way that we know that this is a 5 chord that's major, but because the third is absent, we don't know for sure. This very well could be a minor chord or minor 7 chord because the fifth is absent, so we don't know what quality of triad is at the foundational level of the 7th chord. But because we can make the assumption that diatonically speaking we would expect a diminished triad, we'll analyze it as such. Then we have a couple of passing tones in the lower voices and a leap down here in the alto, which gives us a little bit of like a 1 chord here. We have the D, and the B flat. Oh, sorry, we don't have a G there. I was misreading the clef. But yeah, I guess it's like a little bit of a passing 3-7 chord again, but we don't need to analyze that. I don't think it's really contributing too much to the chord progression. So following the 2-6-5 chord, we get E flat, C, G, and G, which is C minor in first inversion, which is 4-6. We then have A, C, A, and F sharp, which is F sharp diminished over A, that's 7-6. 4 going to 7 is a good sign because that's a normative chord progression. It follows the cycle of falling fifths, same way 6 going to 2, 5 going to 1, 2 going to 5, etc. Then here we have G, D, B flat, and G, which is our tonic triad. We would expect that after a 7 chord. This B flat is a chord tone, this G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark them. And then we cadence on D major, 5, D, D, F sharp, and A, marking this half cadence. Okay, we have another phrase that is in the key of G minor that ends in a perfect authentic cadence, similar to the ending of the first phrase. This is pretty much just a variation of the first phrase. The melody isn't exactly the same, but we do have, a different accompaniment to the melody, but they're more or less achieving a similar pattern. Here we have G minor in root position, G, D, B flat, and D, so we can mark that with 1. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto. We then have B flat, D, D, and D, which would be, I guess, implying B flat major, which would be a 3 chord in root position. You could also make the argument that it's a rootless tonic triad in first inversion as well, so I'll put the 6 underneath it. And then we have some passing tones in the lower voices. We then have B flat, F, D, D, F, D, and A, and we have no F sharp here, so we know that this is a minor 5 chord. We do see these from time to time in Bach, and we usually see them in and around a 3 chord as it kind of, it's more of like a diatonic minor, so we usually see 3 chords in proximity. That's something that I've been reflecting on recently, is the fact that we usually don't see minor 5 in place of like an actual dominant. We usually see them in the middle of the chord progression, usually, and in and around 3 chords, so we'll see if that's true moving forward. Okay, next we have passing tones. Here we have E, G, D, and A. Can't analyze that, or more specifically E flat. Then we have F, A, D, and A. And we could make the argument that this is a 6 chord, but I think this B flat is actually our culprit. It's actually our chord tone, so I'm going to call this 3-6 because it'd be B flat, F, or actually 3. No, I'll take that back. I went back into my notes and I was wrong. I'm going to say that this is 6, but you could also make the argument that this is a 3 chord in second inversion if you look at this B flat as our chord tone, but I think it's less likely because the 6-4 chord really isn't operating in a fashion that we would expect. Granted, Bach has been breaking recently. I say recently as if he's still writing right now, but no. In the chorales we've been looking at recently, we have seen some second inversion triads that have broken the mold as far as what a textbook would outline as far as where you would expect a second inversion triad. So we'll just say that the chord is just being inverted up the scale. Really, it's just a scale pattern going on here. So we're just getting harmonization of the scale as we go up. And as we go up in thirds, we get the 1, the 3, the 5. And instead of getting the 7, we get just 5 inverted because the D is static in the alto as opposed to going down to C, which would give us a 7 chord. And that would just be harmonizing the scale with adjacent harmony, or adjacent harmony in thirds, if that makes sense. Here we have E, G, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion. That is a melodic minor harmonization. That's 4-6. And as we know, 4-6 going to 1 in root position as it ascends, G, B flat, G, and B flat. It's pretty much always connected via the leading tone here, and sometimes we get a fully voiced 7th chord, but when we have the G suspended here, we're not getting it. Even though we have all the makings of it, this G is often something that keeps us from fully analyzing the chord. But there are the components of a 7 chord here, just with like a little suspended tone. Regardless, we have a passing tone in the tenor that takes us to D, D, G, and A. This is a 5 chord with a 4-3 suspension that actually doesn't resolve the way that we would expect it to. I guess you could make the argument this A is also a suspension, but I really think that this is just a D chord that doesn't ever really resolve. This G we would expect to go to F sharp, but instead it goes down to D, giving us another thirdless 5 chord, D, A, D, and A, which then resolves to our tonic G, B flat, D, and G. G minor. And then kind of keeping us from getting a repeat here because the chorale isn't exactly repetitious, we get another half cadence in the key of G minor here. But as you can see, they're similar to one another in terms of their construction, their length, their structure. The 1 chord is followed by another 1 chord, G, D, G, and B flat. This G is a chord tone. We then get A, G, G, and B flat. I think this A is an accented non-chord tone. This B flat is actually our chord tone, leaving us with G minor in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. We then get C, A, E flat, and A, which is A diminished in first inversion. That's a 2-6 chord. We then get C sharp, B flat, G, and G, another kind of interesting harmony where we get a doubled 5th instead of a fully spelled 7th chord, but this is C sharp, fully diminished 7th, which is our leading tone chord, to 5, which is our dominant, and then it resolves to 5, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, like I said. Then we have E flat, C, G, and G, which is C minor in first inversion, and then we cadence on D major again, D, A, F sharp, and A, our 5 chord. And this is a particular type of cadence called a Phrygian half cadence. Not super important that you know that, but the half step movement from the flat 6 in the bass going down to 5 models the first 2 tones of the Phrygian mode, so I think that's probably where the name comes from. Alright, looking ahead, we have our first cadence in the key of F, the first and only, and we don't modulate straight away, but pretty early into the phrase. Happens before these E naturals. Interesting how we get a doubling of the leading tone here, actually, which is interesting. Yes, so we start off with a D major triad, D, D, F sharp, and A. That's still our 5 chord. and then we go to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic triad. And this is our common chord moving to the key of F. It's our supertonic now, the passing seventh in the bass. We then get E, E, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion. That is our dominant now in the key of F, 5, 6, and that resolves to 1, F, C, F, and A, which is F major, our tonic. Passing seventh in the bass before we get D, D, F, and B flat, which is our subdominant in first inversion. That's 4, 6, B flat major over D. We then get C, A, F, and A, which is F major in second inversion because it's over the C, so it's a 1, 6, 4 chord. Neighbor tone in the bass. This F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get C, C, F, and G. This F being a suspension, so we know that 5 is being implied here. We could use this bracket to signify how they are close to one another. And if you recognize this cadence in comparison to the cadence that we've had in a couple of different occasions here, where instead of resolving down, we resolve to another root as opposed to resolving down by step, which is a really interesting gesture. I wonder why Bach did that, because this F is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, but it doesn't resolve to 3 like we would expect, so that's unusual. But regardless, the cadence does end in F major, F, A, C, and F, which is still a tonic triad. So another thirdless 5 chord at the end of a cadence, or towards the end of the cadence, which is unusual. Okay, looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat, and I think we pretty much modulate straight away. We go to G minor here. You could even make the argument that this F chord is our common chord, but I don't really think we have any reason to think that we've modulated yet, and it doesn't sound like we've modulated until just a hair later, to me, at least. So this G minor chord I'm going to call 2. This G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. But I'm going to say we modulate to the key of B flat, and now this G minor chord is our 6. We then get another F major chord, F, C, A, and C, which is our dominant now, not our tonic. And notice how we have E flats now, rather than E naturals. So that's a passing seventh on the bass, and then we're taken to D, B flat, F, and D, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. This C is a non-chord tone. This C is also a non-chord tone. That's a passing tone. And then we're taken to B flat, D, B flat, and D, which is a root position tonic triad. That's a 5/3 chord. Passing tone in the bass before we get G, G, B flat, and E flat, which is E flat major in first inversion. That's our subdominant in first inversion. Then we have a passing tone in the bass before we get E flat, F, B flat, and D. And I reckon this E flat's an accented non-chord tone, and it's really this D and this B flat that are our chord tones, which is just another tonic triad in first inversion. We then get E flat, C, G, and C, which is C minor in first inversion. That's a 2/6 chord. Before we get F major, F, F, C, and C. Again, another thirdless 5 chord. So it's interesting that we see this still implying 5, right? Because we can use logic and association with the chord that we would expect in the scale to get 5 from it, which it's implied. And then we cadence on B flat major, which is our tonic. 1, B flat, F, D, and B flat. Okay, looking ahead to our second to last phrase, we end in a half cadence in the key of G minor. So we're looking for a point on which we modulate, and I don't think we modulate straight away. It doesn't really modulate until around here, and it's kind of a unusual modulation, but it works. We'll analyze it the way that it lays on the page. So we get B flat, F, and D. It's another B flat major triad, no need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the bass. Then we get D, F, F, and D. And the same way that you can make the same argument that this chord right here is a 3 chord or a rootless tonic triad in first inversion. I'm going to call it 3. because this is just D minor without a fifth, 2 roots, 2/3. It's a less common spelling, but we do see that spelling come up in Bach's writing. Then we have some passing tones in the lower voices before we get F, A, F, and C. So we're seeing a pattern here, 1, 3, and 5, which is why I chose to analyze it this way. But this 5 chord is no longer 5 in the key of B flat, but rather 7 in the key of G minor, and it's kind of awkward to modulate using the subtonic 7th when we don't see the tonic immediately afterwards. It's like or when we don't see it spin off into like a falling 5th sequence. We have a neighbor tone here and a neighbor tone there, both neighbor tones in the lower voices, before we get D major in first inversion, F sharp, A, and D, which is 5/6. So 7 going to 5/6. We have seen this in the past. It's an uncommon progression, but here we are seeing it in an example. It's kind of strange. 7 typically wants to go to 1 or to 3, so seeing it go to a dominant is not unheard of. We've seen it here, but it kind of fights my expectations of like what progressions we would see. But then that chord, that D major chord, gets turned into root position here on this beat. Not super important, but I tend to mark those. Doesn't hurt. And then we get G minor afterwards, G, G, D, and B flat, which is our tonic triad. This B flat's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then get F, E flat, G, and C. This F is an accented non-chord tone, so we're really looking at E flat, G, and C, which is C minor in first inversion. That's a 4/6 chord. And then we cadence on 5, D, F sharp, A, and D. So this is another example of a Phrygian half cadence. Not super important that you know that, like I said, but it is an example of it, kind of affirming the textbook and some of the things that the textbook does correctly in terms of the larger generalizations that they make. As we work our way to the last phrase, we end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G minor, no modulation. We have G, D, G, and D, so another thirdless triad here. But it's still a tonic triad as we would expect. Passing tone in the bass. Then we have B flat, D, G, and D. There's the third that was missing. We're now in first inversion. This B flat's a chord tone, this B flat's a chord tone, this F is a chord tone, so we have a little passing 3 chord here if we complete it with the D, but we don't really need to mark it, it's not super important. Here we have E, G, E, and C. Those E naturals make the C triad major, and it's in first inversion. Notice how all of the major 4 chords are in first inversion. That's something that's pretty typical in Bach's music in general. It's really interesting. It's because I imagine the melodic minor has something to do with that. But then we have some passing tones here, and or 2 passing tones in the lower voices, and then an anticipation in the alto. We have D, F sharp, A, and C. So we have a passing 5/6/5 chord. That's D7 over F sharp, and that is a chord I will mark because 4 going to 5 is a normative progression, and we are seeing a 4/6 chord in root position ascend to a tonic triad, G, B flat, D, and B flat, via the leading tone connecting the 2 tones, or the 2 notes, the 6 and the 1. And sometimes we get a fully voiced chord connecting it, but bare minimum we typically get the F sharp. I think we've only seen 1 or maybe 2 out of dozens of cases where we've had this instance happen, so it's far more common than not. This B flat, this G, this D, and this B flat turn the chord briefly into first inversion before we get C, C, E flat, and A, which is A diminished in first inversion. It's a 2/6 chord. That gets turned briefly into root position on the next beat, or the next and. We then go to D major, D, F sharp, A, and A, which is a 5 chord. D major, it's our dominant, we've seen it before. And then we cadence on not G minor, but G major, G, D, B natural, and G, as the chorale is typically the last movement of the cantata, and in minor chorales, Bach often ends on a major tonic triad, I imagine just to end in a more uplifting fashion. But regardless, that is today's analysis. We had a very dense chorale to look at today, but all in all, pretty much the harmony was exclusively functional. We had a couple of interesting chord progressions. Chord progressions tend to get interesting when we have long scalar passages in the bass, and that is compounded with scalar passages that are chromatic scale rather than the minor scale. So we see some funky chord progressions here, like 1, 3, 5, with the 5 being minor, like in this case, and it's just a byproduct of the scale just ascending. But when we see a little bit more staggering in the bass, a little bit more movement, it tends to be more normal, a chord progression, more usual. So it's interesting to see Bach switch out of that mode of long scalar passages to alternating between skips and steps, and it creates harmonic variety that way that we would expect. But here, the introduction of the chorale is probably the most, probably the hallmark of the chorale as far as the harmony is concerned. But I'm going to end the analysis on those thoughts. Thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you for subscribing to the channel. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, feel free to do so. I release a video once a day, and I'm currently working on the chorale harmonizations, if you couldn't have already told from just the videos that I've uploaded over the last couple of months. If you want to be notified of my time in which I upload, feel free to hit the notification icon as well. Like I mentioned, I do upload once a day, so if you want your daily dose of analysis, and more specifically if you'd like a daily dose of J.S. Bach analysis, feel free to subscribe. There are tons of videos on the horizon. But that being said, again, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.